I know this sounds strange, but you have to understand this one thing about me. I don't just hear music, I see it. My name is Nala, and I'm 27. Most people look at the world and see shapes and light. I see a chaotic, beautiful symphony of colors that others can't even imagine. The smell of rain on hot asphalt is a dense, vibrating indigo. Sharp, genuine laugh is a streak of chaotic neon yellow. My own name, when spoken with kindness, is a soft, swirling lavender. But music? That's where my universe clicks into focus, where the overwhelming static of the world resolves into a breathtaking landscape. When my fingers hit the keys of a piano, I'm not just playing notes, I'm translating the messy, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying internal weather of my own mind into something real, something that holds its shape. For me, as an autistic woman with synesthesia, music isn't a passion or a skill. It's my native tongue, the only way I can truly, unapologetically exist. Right now, my whole life revolves around one thing, the recital. It's next week at the conservatory, and it's the most important night of my life. Not because of the critics or the audience, but because it's my final desperate attempt to speak my language in public without apology. I've been practicing 15 hours a day, watching the rich emeralds and swirling burgundies of my chosen sonata spill out across the air. This isn't for applause. This is an act of self-preservation, because I know what they want. See, my whole life has been a quiet, brutal fight against the gray. Since I was a kid, everyone, doctors with their cold, clinical white coats, teachers with their rigid beige classrooms, even well-meaning family, saw my colors not as a gift, but as a glitch that needed to be patched. They taught me to mask, to stand still when my body needed to move, to smile when I didn't feel it, to force the volume down on the whole vibrant world until I was just quiet. That pressure, that constant demand to conform, it wasn't just confusing, it was genuinely traumatic. It felt like being suffocated by silence, like the joy was being systematically vacuumed out of my soul, leaving a dull, aching void. And that's the terrifying secret I carry. The gray isn't just an idea, it's a collective presence, a judgmental, joyless force I call the storm. They are the people who have succeeded in extinguishing their own color, and now they live only to impose that bland, dull conformity on everyone else. My greatest fear isn't dying, it's being broken down so completely that I become one of them, a storm, doomed to hunt down and snuff out the beautiful chaos in others. The recital is my final declaration. I won't be silenced. I won't be made gray. But lately, the storm has been getting closer. My own colors have started to flicker under the pressure, especially in the cold, empty air of the concert hall. And just last night, when I looked out my apartment window at the city lights, usually a stunning, chaotic blaze of ruby, sapphire, and gold, there was a perfect, silent patch of ash gray just hovering there, flat and terrible, right over the center of the city. It wasn't just stealing the color, it was watching. And I think it finally heard my music. I tried to shake off that image. It had to be a trick of the city fog, of temperature inversion, or maybe I was just tired from all the practice. My little practice room at the conservatory is usually my safe haven. When I close the door, the rich, warm mahogany of the wood generates a comforting, steady hum of deep violet and ochre, a protective field against the outside world. But the day after I saw the gray patch, the hum was gone. The wood of the door didn't feel solid anymore. It felt porous, like the color was seeping out, becoming thin and weak. And then, as I was playing the climax of my concerto, a huge soaring explosion of deep crimson and brilliant turquoise, the entire mahogany panel just flickered. Not just the color, but the texture. For a breathless second, the door was a dead, smooth, office cubicle beige, silent as dust. It scared me, but I rationalized it immediately. Sensory overload. I pushed on, forcing the notes, forcing the color. That's when Professor Sterling walked in without knocking. He's a genuinely decent man, the head of the department, but his presence, usually a gentle, scholarly tan, felt oppressive today. I was trying to hold on to the ruby notes hanging in the air, but they were weakening under his gaze, dissolving like smoke. He listened, nodding slowly, and when he finished, he gave me the critical comment I've heard 100 times in 100 different ways. Technically proficient, Nala, very good, but it lacks discipline. Too much uncontrolled passion. You need to rate it in for the audience. That word, discipline, it hit my ears, and it wasn't just sound. It was a harsh, scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across glass, a color of sickly pale green. As he spoke, the gentle tan of his aura didn't just dim, it inverted. A tall, oily silhouette, like a shadow, poured into the shape of a man, stretched up behind him. It was a storm. His normal, kind face briefly blurred into a horrifying void of roiling static, and a cruel, cold, mocking mouth momentarily formed, twisting the edges of his polite, concerned expression. The air around him suddenly felt cold and empty, and I realized the storm wasn't just near, it was wearing him. It was using his good intentions as a mask. I slammed the fall board down, cutting the final chord short. The sudden silence was absolute. Even the usual low pulse of the room's electric light, a buzzing siren, vanished. My heart was pounding, a chaotic, terrified red thudding in my chest. I stared at his normal, worried human face and tried to deny the horrifying truth of what I had just seen. It was fatigue, I told myself. The stress of the recital is finally making me crack. I need to be more rational. I decided to test the theory, sitting back down and trying to play its simple, joyful childhood tune, an act of pure, expressive self-love that I knew should generate blinding, protective color. Before I could even touch the keys, Sterling stepped closer, his expression tightening with a kind of urgent, misguided pity that felt more violating than anger. He leaned in, and the shadow that wore him thickened, became more solid. His voice dropped, losing its professorial warmth and taking on the chilling, flat resonance of the void. "Nala, listen to me," he commanded, his voice a perfect monotone stripped of all color. "You must control this, for your own good." As the words left his mouth, his human features completely dissolved. Standing 2 feet from me was the storm, fully formed. It was impossibly tall, a featureless column of dark, sickening gray that seemed to absorb all light and sound, a pillar of pure, judgmental negation. The air shrieked in my ears, not with a painful sound, but with the terrifying absence of sound, the audible draining of life and vibrancy from the room. All the brilliant emeralds and rubies I had painted in the air with my music shriveled instantly, collapsing into pathetic specks of dead color that fell to the floor like ash. The storm reached out its hand, a shadowy, indistinct limb that seemed to be made of compressed silence. I was frozen, trapped by the terrifying realization that my professor's well-meaning critique was the native language of the enemy, and I had just been cornered in my sanctuary. My last defense, my music, was dead and dying all around me. You know that feeling when you try to scream but your throat locks up? That was my whole body. The storm wasn't touching me, but the sheer weight of its judgment was crushing. Its voice, that flat, depthless tone, was echoing the voice of every person who ever told me I was too much, that I needed to be normal. It was my lifetime of trauma given a physical form. I couldn't fight it. My brain was screaming escape, but my body was locked down, paralyzed by the sheer sensory dread of that oppressive silence. The storm's hand, that blurry, indistinct gray claw, was inching toward my face, not to strike me, but to simply erase me. And then I did the only thing I could. I didn't think about escaping the room. I thought about escaping the silence. With a convulsive jerk, I found a tiny pocket of defiance in my chest, a spark of furious ruby-red anger, and I slammed my fist down hard on the lowest bass keys of the piano. It wasn't music, it was a desperate, ugly sound. A dissonant, vibrating chord of ugly brown and jagged crimson. But it broke the freeze. The storm recoiled. Not because the sound was loud, but because it was real. It was an authentic, immediate expression of my terror, not a practiced, polished performance. The ash-gray field surrounding the entity flickered, and I saw a terrifying moment of confusion in its static void of a face. That was all the time I needed. I scrambled backward, tripping over the piano bench, and burst out of the room, slamming the solid mahogany door shut behind me. But the conservatory hallways were no better. The usual chaos of student life was gone. Everything was muted, drained. The overhead fluorescent lights were a dull, sickly beige. I realized what had happened. The storm that were Sterling hadn't just appeared, it had arrived. Its presence was like a conceptual virus, muting the entire environment, preparing to ground forward the recital. My only option was forward, to the stage. I was supposed to be performing in 10 minutes. I passed other students, the colors gone, their skin shimmering with the same oily distortion I'd seen on Sterling. They were infected. I reached the heavy velvet curtain backstage, my hands shaking so badly they generated a frantic, discordant noise like 1,000 tiny bells rattling together. I was announced. The stage manager gave me a thin, blank smile. No color, no warmth, just teeth. I pushed through the curtain. The stage was bathed in blinding, clinical white light, a color of pure exposure. As I looked up, the music in my head, a dazzling sequence of sapphire and emerald, dissolved into a fine, gray mist. Because the audience was no longer an audience. Every face in the huge tiered auditorium was doing the same sickening dance of transformation. Friends, peers, my parents, they were all shedding their humanity. They were all storms. Hundreds of them, impossibly tall and featureless columns of silent, sickening gray. The pressure of their collective attention was a physical force pressing down on my chest. And then the assimilation started. A thin, oily gray vapor, the color of giving up, slithered toward me and began to climb my hands. As it seeped into my skin, the constant, chaotic, beautiful noise of my synesthetic world began to quiet, and it felt good. For the first time in my life, everything was silent.
The terrifying, beautiful burden of perpetual perception was lifted. A cold, soothing peace spread through my wrists. The gray whispered a promise in my mind. It's so much easier here, Nala. You don't have to fight. Just stop. This was the true horror. The temptation of conformity. The relief of letting go and becoming nothing. I was halfway gone. My right hand, completely gray, numb, and cold. I closed my eyes. It was over. But then, just as the gray reached my elbow, I heard a sound that wasn't a sound. It was the echo of my own voice, 8 years old, playing a clumsy, chaotic melody that was purely, vibrantly mine. It was an explosive burst of pure, unadulterated childish joy, a blinding slash of magenta and gold. Defiance! I opened my eyes, ignoring the 100-faced silent legion. I ignored the sheet music. I lifted my left hand, the one not yet consumed, and slammed it down onto the keys in a frantic, terrifying, beautiful scramble. The sounds were ugly, loud and dissonant to anyone else, but to me, they were a desperate prayer. Jagged emeralds fighting dull ash, burning cadmium red against the spreading beige. It was pure, unmasked chaos, the sound of my autistic inner world finally, publicly, unapologetically released. My right gray hand twitched. The storms in the audience stirred not in anger, but in what looked like agony. My chaotic personal music was the one thing they couldn't absorb because it contained no self-doubt, no plea for validation, and absolutely no discipline. It was just me screaming my truth into existence. I pressed harder, improvising a language of survival. The colors burst from the piano, a hurricane of swirling sapphire, toxic green, and brilliant, blinding gold. The collective presence wavered. Then the storms began to break down. They didn't explode. They collapsed inward on themselves, imploding into piles of fine, dry ash that immediately began to blow away, leaving empty seats behind. The human faces they had worn reappeared for a split second and then vanished. One by one, the vast, judgmental congregation withered. When the last storm had dissolved into a faint whisper of dust, I kept playing, flooding the hall with my color, my chaos, myself.
The last note, a soaring, vibrant ultramarine, faded into a profound, exhausted silence. I sat there, hunched over the piano, bathed in the blinding, beautiful afterglow of my own colors. My right hand, the one that had been gray, was now just my hand. Cold, throbbing, but free. I looked out into the cavernous recital hall. It was completely, utterly empty. The seats were still there, rows and rows of red velvet, but there was no one in them. Just faint, barely visible layers of ash dusting the cushions and the polished floor. It smelled like rain after a fire. Clean, empty, and strangely metallic. I survived. I beat the storm. Not with a weapon, but with an act of complete, terrifying self-acceptance. That was the cruel joke. The heart of my trauma. They had spent my entire life telling me that if I stopped masking, if I let my true self out, I would be rejected, punished, and destroyed. And tonight, I finally let my true self out, and the storm, the ultimate manifestation of judgmental rejection, was literally destroyed by it. I finally understood. The storms weren't destroyed by music. They were destroyed by unconditional self-expression. They are the void created by people who deny their own light, and they feast on the doubt of those who still possess color. My fear, the fear of forced assimilation, was literally the fuel that gave them power.
The closer I got to being me, the weaker they became. The moment I chose my own chaos over their silent, seductive peace, I starved them into non-existence. I pushed myself up from the bench. My legs were unsteady. I was alone, standing on a massive stage, under the cold spotlight, facing an empty hall that had just been witness to the death of my old life. I walked off the stage, through the silent backstage area, and out into the empty hallway. The light was still sickly, the air still muted, but now I knew the difference. The gray wasn't gone, it was just in retreat. It was waiting for the next time I faltered, the next time a doubt, a self-critical thought, or a judgmental voice entered my head. I stepped outside, into the night air. The city lights were still mostly ruby and gold, but I saw tiny, isolated patches of ash gray flickering everywhere, in the windows of apartments, on the edges of street signs. They were small, distant, and watching. I am Nala. I see the colors, and they tried to steal them. But now, they know my language. And the fight, I realize, has only just begun.
Thank you so much for watching or listening. Like and subscribe for more nightmares. Your support keeps the darkness from consuming this channel, so we can face the next terrifying story together. Don't be left in the dark.